I think it's incredibly important to develop a science of behavior. Almost all of the world's problems, if not all of the world's problems, are problems of human behavior. Whether it's famine, whether it's war, whether it's disease, these are problems of what people do or what they fail to do. So if we want to change those things, if we want to solve these problems, the only way we're going to do it is to change behavior. And the only way we're going to successfully change behavior, at least on a large scale, is to have a well-developed science of behavior. And that's what always excited me about this field, and it's what continues to excite me about this field.
There are a number of different sciences that study behavior. Behavior analysis is one of them. For example, there are people who study the effects of genes on behavior. There are people who study the effects of the brain and the nervous system on behavior. Behavior analysts study the effects of environment on behavior. And I would call behavior analysis a natural science. And by the way, the natural sciences are chemistry, physics, and biology typically. Psychology is never considered to be a natural science. Behavior analysis is natural science because it focuses on objective, observable events, and it looks for causes that are physical.
For many years, behavior analysis in universities, for example, is often housed in psychology departments or special education departments. Consequently, many of those of us who do our work as behavior analysts within school systems have started off, and our initial focus was students in special education. But that's changing. There's some different types of initiatives in general education, response to intervention, multi-tiered systems of support, and the growing emphasis in general education is on tackling academic, learning, and behavior problems with data and data that's graphically displayed. This has been a part of behavior analysis forever, the reliance on data-based decision-making and the reliance on a graphic display of this data. So what we are finding in education, in general education, is that behavior analysts are consistently more relied upon for our expertise because we understand how to collect data. We understand how to be objective. We almost all know how to graph data, and we know how to interpret graphic displays of data.
The reason why the design and the implementation of education policy should be based on evidence is really maybe capitalized in that sentence of learning is only as good as the teaching that we get. So we would need to give people very, very good teaching, and behavior analysis as a foundation of learning how to teach gives you the theoretical basis. And then we can assess how well people learn. And one of the things in behavior analysis, because it is a science, it evidences how people learn, the process of learning and the outcome of learning. So we're not just outcome-based, we're also process-based. We use a methodology, a research methodology called single system design, where we take a baseline. Basically, we look at what behaviors are there, how far has a person come in their development so far. We then implement the intervention, and we continue to take data during that implementation time, and we then take data afterwards. So that way we can adjust the intervention, adjust our teaching styles. If the person is not learning what they're supposed to be learning, then we adjust the teaching style until we have the evidence that they have now learned the material. Behavior analysis is particularly important for the area of education because it is a science of how we learn. It is not just about learning theories, it's a lot deeper than that, but learning theories is obviously one very, very important part of it. And really understanding why people behave the way they do behave and understanding the very basic principles of behaviour are very, very important for teachers, but also for people in the education sector more broadly. We're talking obviously about schools in the first place and pupils, but we're also talking about education, as I say, with a capital E. So education in the sense of lifelong education in all sorts of settings, and not just in school settings, but also in after-school settings, in the evenings, in colleges and further education and higher education colleges.
The context of learning and education. Well, the context is a context in which people are behaving. You've got the learner and you've got the educator. So of the behaviour of two different people. So the educator is somebody who will be arranging a learning context, so arranging material for the student to learn. And if that teacher does a good job, then what you'll see is a change in the learner. If the learner is not doing well, then you could blame the learner, as is often done in traditional education practices. Or you could ask yourself, maybe I should readjust my context, my education context, to facilitate learning. that becomes a question. Is it possible to do that? Is it possible to facilitate learning? And there's stacks of evidence to show, yes, it is possible to facilitate learning. So the science of behaviour analysis then is the science which gives you guidance on how to structure the learning context to facilitate learning. And that involves then understanding learning as it evolves and understanding teaching as it directs that learning. And so you have the two working together.
I often refer to human beings as the learning animal, which means that humans learn more than any other animal. Now, a lot of other people like to cite other differences between humans and non-humans, but for me, the primary difference is that we simply learn more. I refer to that as behavioral plasticity. Now, the fundamental basis of that behavioral plasticity is neuroplasticity. And when neuroscientists refer to neuroplasticity, they refer to two things. The first thing they refer to is that in the face of brain damage, sometimes the brain can repair itself. But the thing that's more important to the topic at hand is that learning constantly is programming the brain. And you know, from our perspective, the brain and human behavior are probably infinitely programmable or infinitely malleable. So that's what when I refer to human beings as the learning animal, what I mean is that we have pretty much an infinite capacity to learn. And it starts before we even come out into the world when we're in the womb, and it ends the day we die. When learning occurs, obviously, there's a biological basis for it. I mean, there's a biological basis for everything we do. The brain is the proximate cause of everything that we do. When learning occurs, whether it's Pavlovian or operant learning, there are obviously changes in the brain. Now, as I mentioned, neuroscientists study the brain and how it affects behavior, and behavior analysts study how the environment affects behavior. Some people criticize behavior analysts for not considering the neurological underpinnings of behavior, but it's not that we don't consider them, we just don't study them. We fully acknowledge that they provide the neurological basis for all of our behavior. There's been research over the past 40 or 50 years which has documented various changes in the central nervous system when learning occurs. So for example, we know that dopamine is one of the primary neurotransmitters involved in reward centers and reinforcement. We know that certain parts of the brain are more involved than others when reinforcement occurs. But I would add that and B.F. Skinner has talked about this as well, you can study learning, that is, you can study the effects of behavior, the effects of environment on behavior without understanding how the nervous system works. You can have a theory of behavior or a science of behavior without any knowledge or understanding of how the nervous system works. But I don't think you can have a science or theory of how the nervous system works without having a science or theory of behavior, because the theory of behavior, the science of behavior, provides neuroscientists with a roadmap for how to study the brain and how to look for the effects that occur in the brain when learning occurs. So it's important to acknowledge that the physiological underpinnings of learning and behavior, but it's not necessary to know them or to understand them in order to understand how learning affects behavior. When we speak about learning, what we're talking about are certain specific experiences that produce relatively permanent changes in environment-behavior relations. Now, I need to clarify what that means. The specific experiences are Pavlovian and operant conditioning, which I'll talk about. And what we mean by relatively permanent changes is we mean that once learning occurs, it's permanent unless another learning experience interferes to change it. When we talk about relations between environment and behavior, we're talking about generally stimuli and responses. So for example, in Pavlovian conditioning, when we pair a neutral stimulus with an unconditional stimulus, the neutral stimulus becomes a conditional stimulus and it elicits a conditional response. So the learning isn't just the conditional response, it's the relationship between the conditional stimulus and the conditional response. In operant conditioning, if a rat presses a lever when the light is on, then what is learned and gets food for that, what is learned isn't just a lever press, it's the lever press when the light is on. So the definition of learning refers to those specific types of experiences, Pavlovian and operant conditioning, that produce permanent changes in those relations between environment and behavior. As applicable as Pavlovian conditioning is to human behavior, operant conditioning is even more applicable, because operant conditioning really refers to the learning of behaviors that interact or operate on the environment, and that includes everything we do. From the most trivial things, such as picking up a cup of coffee, to more complex things like talking to somebody. And so when you have a type of learning that encompasses almost everything that an organism does, then it ends up being very important. And it's also, I think, important to point out that operant conditioning has been demonstrated with a wide range of species, including, and I would argue especially humans, because of the behavioral plasticity that I mentioned earlier. But it's been demonstrated with insects, it's been demonstrated in individual neurons, and most especially in human beings.
The natural consequences for a good education are far too delayed. They're in the future, number one, but they're even far too delayed to influence behavior now. They are not effective reinforcers, which means we have to create, the teacher's responsibility is to create a learning environment that's motivating, to arrange reinforcement contingencies that will promote academic behavior, that makes it worthwhile for the students to do things where if they were left to their own devices, they probably wouldn't do them because there aren't natural outcomes that are reinforcing for engaging in those behaviors. So the teacher's responsibility is to first clearly establish, clearly define what it is that is going to be taught, and then what are the steps to get to those ultimate educational outcomes. To develop a way to track progress towards those outcomes, and then to develop an incentive kind of system by which students will be motivated to work on those academic skills that lead to those educational outcomes. First, it's important to clarify something, and that's behavior is being shaped all of the time, whether we're doing it intentionally or unintentionally. When we're talking about educational systems, we're talking about systems that arrange things that will shape behavior in certain ways. But we need to appreciate that even if we're not intending to shape behavior, we are. But more importantly, other people are also shaping behavior in the individuals we're working with, and the physical environment itself, without our mediation, shapes behavior. So it's not just us interacting with the student. The environment as a whole interacts with the student. So what we, if we're an educator, try to do is create more powerful kinds of arrangements that will sort of supersede the more natural ones that we're not controlling or that we're not aware of. So the educational systems identify what they view as important skills, what society views as important skills for students to learn. And then the educator arranges conditions that intentionally, hopefully, shape those behaviors to what they need to be because they're not now. So they start with basic skills and work up. So it starts, as a very basic example, with very young children. They learn to read. They're taught to read, to just sight read at first even. Not necessarily what we would call reading with comprehension, but in early skills to simply teach reading. But simply reading words on a page obviously is not the valued outcome of an education. You've got to get more to that. They have to be able to read and then behave differently in certain ways with respect to what they've just read. But that's different. That's a higher skill set. So you start with a simpler kind of behavior, which is simply reading words on a page without necessarily being able to do anything more as a result of having read those words, and you gradually introduce more complexity to it over time, and that's a way that behavior would intentionally be shaped. Another, again, simplistic, basic example would be with mathematics. Well, a student can't do long division if they can't add and subtract. Right? So you begin by teaching things like addition and subtraction and gradually increasing the complexity of what they're asked to do. And what they're asked to do later on builds on what they were taught to do early on. So what starts as a much simpler kind of math becomes a much more complicated kind of math as time goes on. And so the reinforcers change. Once the child has successfully demonstrated they can do addition and subtraction, now things like grades aren't so heavily dependent on addition and subtraction. That's a given. Now the grades become on different ways that you combine addition and subtraction to do higher level math. And that's what's important to produce, not the simpler things anymore. So the reinforcers are largely discontinued for the simpler skills, and now they're available only for more complex skills that involve those simpler skills. And those are explicit ways that behavior is shaped. In general, what teachers want to do is recognize that for behavior to occur again, it has to be reinforced. So we have to consider what's reinforcing to the individual students and how we can make those reinforcers reliably follow good academic performance. And we want to make sure that they don't follow other kinds of things that we don't want to see, like poor performance or problem behavior. We want to capitalize on what we know about motivational conditions from behavior analysis, so that if those kinds of reinforcers are readily available, they're going to be far less effective or ineffective if we try to use them to promote good academic behavior. We want to understand that because a child can do something doesn't mean they'll do it at the right times or the appropriate time. So once we teach them how to do something, we also have to worry about stimulus control, establishing discriminative stimuli that will control the performance so they do it at the appropriate times, in the appropriate places, in the appropriate ways.
One of the most important jobs I have in my roles as a behavior analyst is helping schools conduct functional behavior assessments. The idea of function means that human behavior is purposeful, that there's a reason that certain behaviors result in consequences, and those consequences ultimately determine whether or not the behaviors are more or less likely. And so when you're a behavior analyst, you take a very systematic, deliberate approach to the assessment of problem behavior and try to help people identify what consequences are following problem behavior, because by altering those consequences, you can change whether or not a behavior is more or less likely. So we get appropriate prosocial adaptive behaviors to happen more often, and we get problematic behaviors to occur less often. So going into schools, I'm constantly spending time doing direct observation of students. I'm interviewing participants who are central to the children's lives that I serve. We extensively review the records that exist so we can find relevant information in those, and we take all that data and we put it together and we come up with a hypothesis, an educated guess about what is maintaining or reinforcing problem behavior. And once we know what reinforces problem behavior, we can design an effective program to make sure that, again, the problem behavior doesn't meet the consequence that it has before, that it meets that adaptive prosocial academic behaviors contact natural contingencies of reinforcement, and therefore the student is more likely to engage in behaviors that help the student adjust in school. You begin by reviewing records, always getting into the records and reading prior evaluations that have been done. Again, detailed reports that other professionals have done so you can get a better understanding of the student. You then typically interview people who are central to that student's life. That can include teachers, teaching assistants, parents, coaches, whomever is interacting regularly with the child. The next and probably the most critical piece of a functional behavior assessment is direct observation. Behavior analysts believe that we learn more from directly observing the person in the actual environment where behavior happens than by doing any other activity that we do. So we spend a great deal of time collecting data, writing down, again, the things that precede behavior, we call them antecedents, the behavior itself, and then the consequences, the things that follow behavior. We take all that information together, and again, a functional behavior assessment is aimed at two things: identifying a hypothesis, an educated guess about why the behavior occurs, and secondly, determining whether or not the behavior requires intervention. They can be remarkably effective in developing effective treatments for children. Just to give you a few examples, we had a student before who would punch other children, and it was typically children who had teased him before. And so when we identified that the function of him punching the students was to remove them from his presence, we then taught him an alternative skill. We taught him to say, "Move away," and then we made those peers honor the request of moving away from him when he said move away. By saying move away, he would get the peers to move out of his presence versus punching him. Punching is an effective and efficient way for children to get other children away from them, but we want children to communicate. We want them to speak. And so by rehearsing that, practicing, reinforcing the vocalization, the speech, the request for the other children to move, we resulted in massively decreasing his aggressive behavior. Oftentimes when students are younger, particularly in early education, in kindergarten and in first grade, they come to us sometimes with a lack of skills in areas in which they need to perform and an overabundance of skills that are typically deemed problematic by schools. And one of the things we often find is those students have a reliance on what we will refer to as contrived reinforcers. Over the course of time, the people who love them, the people who care about them and teach them, oftentimes have given them things, extra treats and what have you, to try in an attempt to get them to do the things they need to do. What we try to do as behavior analysts is identify the reinforcers that occur naturally in the environment. And if we have to use those contrived reinforcers, we will. We're pragmatic. We'll use whatever works. But we try to use the contrived reinforcers, pair them with more natural reinforcers in the classroom environment, and ultimately those natural reinforcers will become the things that perpetuate appropriate behavior in the classrooms and school settings.
In terms of the long term, though, you of course don't want that the student is always reliant on incredibly clear study objectives, for example, and some very salient reinforcer for completing an assignment. You want to thin those out. You want to fade the prompts so that the, for example, study objectives become less specific, and maybe at some point they're removed altogether. The reinforcers become less frequent and maybe less powerful in some ways. They're more subtle. But with respect to the student getting to a point where they've created their own natural reinforcers, it's important to understand that the student doesn't create their reinforcers. Those reinforcers are created by their prior experiences, right? Their experience in their earlier educational environments is what turns things into reinforcers. The educational reinforcers that people are interested in aren't innately reinforcing to us, and that's the whole problem. If they were, we wouldn't need educational systems. Students, children would just learn these kinds of things. They would just thrive in these academic environments because the outcomes would be reinforcers, but they're not. They have to be established. And how do you do that? Well, it starts with those early learning environments where you do the detailed learning outcomes that you want. You provide help so that they make few errors. You provide salient reinforcers that are powerful, because doing that maximizes the success that they have early on. It allows them to contact reinforcement in the situation where they're doing a lot of other things as well. So those kinds of reinforcing activities and outcomes become paired with a lot of other aspects of the educational environment, so that as time goes on, those other aspects, what we usually look at as more natural educational reinforcers, do become reinforcers. They are reinforced when they, for example, successfully complete a math problem. Now, early on, there's really no reason that should be reinforcing at all. What does it matter? It matters only because of a history in which doing that has also produced other kinds of outcomes that were already reinforcing for the student. If they're engaging in activities, academic activities, where they contact a lot of reinforcement, the outcomes, the experiences of those activities themselves can be reinforcing. So, is the monitoring of behavioral progress necessary in a child's academic career throughout their career? I would say yes. I think if something is worth changing, anything is worth changing, it's worth measuring, and really it needs to be measured. Because if you don't measure it, you can't possibly know whether it's changed or not. And if it does change, you don't know how much it's changed or in what way that it's changed. So if you've clearly defined what children need to be able to do or not do, and that's important, then you have to measure what they can and what they can't do. I don't see any way other than measuring it to know whether or not they're progressing the way that they should be. So measurement is critical. It's a very critical first step toward changing behavior. Measurement doesn't necessarily change behavior, but without measuring the behavior, you're never going to know if it changed or not.
Precision teaching has 4 guiding principles. First, focus on observable behavior. This is, we need to be able to count the thing of interest. So for instance, if we're looking at how many words a child can read, we need to be able to count the number of correct and number of errors during that time period. The second guiding principle is to use frequency as the performance criteria. So this is the number of times that behavior, be it reading, be it writing, be it maths, occurs within a given period of time. The third guiding principle is the use of a chart. Precision teaching has a chart called the standard acceleration chart, but essentially the chart has calendar days across the bottom of the chart, and it also has frequency on the y-axis. And this allows us to capture performance of an individual learner on a daily basis within a set period of time. It's a snapshot of their learning at that moment in time. The final guiding principle is that the learner knows best. So we use the learner's charted data to guide us in navigating them through the tasks in hand.
Percentage change is a legitimate change measure. Percentage, like anything else, does what it's supposed to do. Mathematically, it's a ratio. If you have a behavior that occurs 9 out of 10 times, the ratio is 90. 9 out of 10, that turns into a percentage of 90%. That tells you something. It tells you this person, their accuracy is 90%. But what is the time? Let's say we have 2 individuals. If you score a 90% and I score a 90%, but you took 1 minute to get your 9 out of 10, but it took me 2 minutes to get 9 out of 10. Which one of us knows that information better, you or I? Clearly you do, because you had 9 out of 10 in a minute. It took me 2 minutes to do 9 out of 10. That percentage is going to completely ignore the time frame. If you have a class of students, that's very valuable. If you can't know with precision what is the time differences, then you're missing out on how competent one person is from the next person. Percentage correct has limitations. We don't need to live with those limitations in our education system. If we live with those limitations, who is suffering from that? It's the student. Our goal is to help all students achieve their goals, to recognize their potential as quickly as we can. If we're not using sensitive measures such as frequency, then we have to live with the limitations of percent correct. Frequency places behavior in time. The other thing that we've noticed and we've known through research is that you can make predictions about the future when you're using accurate predictions about the future when you're using frequency. You can't make very accurate predictions when you're using percentage correct. Therefore, frequency is a superior measure to percentage correct. We do have evidence that shows students as young as kindergarten can use the standard acceleration chart. We know with self-monitoring, when students are involved in their data, they own that data. They are interested in seeing what happens when I'm doing. Have I got to my aim yet? Students very much like that. Yes, students should be charting their own data and they should be involved in it. Some people say, well, what if students can't count? That's a problem. Anybody that charts any data, if they want to evaluate it, then those numbers on that scale, if they don't understand numbers or counting, it's going to be difficult for them to use any chart. But we can still show them a very simple relationship. Here's your aim up here, here's your dots, and oh look, your dots are going up to that aim. Even though you don't know the numbers, kids can still get excited about that, and they can see, I did better than yesterday. And with our standard acceleration chart, because it's standard, those angles are going to be the same for all students. And it's going to show them if you are really making dramatic progress, the slope of the line is going to be steeper. If you're not making dramatic progress, if you're making slower progress, then that line is going to be lower. We want students to be involved in their learning. We want students to share in the excitement of their progress and their reaching towards their goals. Not allowing students to see their charts, not allowing students to do their own charting, that is not allowing the students to experience the joy and the fun of this whole learning process. I would strongly encourage everybody who is charting, allow the students to do their own charting. If they can't do their own charting, then at least allow the students to look at their own chart and explain it in very basic terms. The other reason why students want to chart is because sometimes they can come up with their own interventions and they can say, okay, I want to try this. And they try that and they see how does that affect their learning. And that is a way of involving the learner in the learning process. And the more you can involve the learner in the learning process, then the greater chance you have of having that student highly motivated to achieve their goals.
PT can be used to teach any academic subject or to measure the outcome of that teaching. In that way, it can become even more potent when used with good instructional technologies, good instructional designs. Another method of teaching, a method of instruction that came out of the States called direct instruction, has been used as the instructional part and PT to measure those outcomes, and together they form a synergy that is even further improved. How else can we help to bring precision teaching methods to the fore? Well, certainly having a focus on learning rather than just teaching practice. I know that most teacher training schemes around the country probably don't introduce teachers to precision teaching. I feel it has such a significant contribution it could make in equipping teachers with extra information that they might utilize when they're teaching. Clearly, there are implications for when you're measuring all the children in a class. There are clearly implications, but if you have that training behind you, you can implement it when needed. We need to also perhaps influence teachers and give them the training also in how to carry out research within the classroom. Remember, we've got evidence-based practice, so we use technologies that are proven to work, but we need practice-based evidence where we're collecting information and checking that those things are working within the classroom setting. So I feel if teachers were introduced to how they could carry out small research projects just to measure how things are going, I think that would be advantageous as well.
So, some comments about the way technology might be used to facilitate learning or be used with precision teaching approaches. Well, I'm not an expert on precision teaching, but I can talk, I think, generally about how technology might be useful to facilitate learning. To start, though, I think it's important, and most people would probably say this, that technology, especially like digital technology, computer technology, is not going to solve all of the world's problems. It in and of itself is not the fix. It's how that technology is used. But certainly modern technology can allow us to do really incredible things that we couldn't do before, and maybe even more so that we can do things that were very, very effortful before much easier now. So, for example, devices like the smartphone allow us to record all sorts of behavior in real time, so much easier than we ever could before. And we can even provide immediate feedback about the behavior to the individual. They get, if they want them, immediate records of what they're doing. For example, and this is probably the easiest example, exercise. Right now, you carry your smartphone around with you. It will tell you in real time how many steps you've taken. It could estimate for you how many calories you've burned, and you can get that feedback in real time. You can also get programs that will provide consequences for certain set levels of behavior in real time. They might be monetary consequences. You might earn points that are exchangeable for goods, or you might earn money for engaging in certain levels of behavior. We can use that kind of technology to help people who are dealing, let's say, a teacher in a classroom with behavior problems. By keying in what's happening, they could get suggestions about what to do next as a result of the information provided. Now, none of these things are foolproof in and of themselves. They're just technology. They're only as good as the information that goes in and the people who design them in terms of their understanding the situations that they're going to be used in. But certainly they have the potential because they can record so much, they can track so much in real time that we couldn't before, and they allow us to interact with people at a distance where we couldn't before. We could do really good things with it. In terms of education, I think people look a lot when they think of technology, they look to personal computers. And certainly, those I think have been underutilized in education. Too much probably reliance on the computer in and of itself fixing everything because it's technology, less what we already knew was important to do and how we could do it better with computers. Going back to Skinner's teaching machine from the 1950s, well, computers can be that teaching machine so much more efficiently and in such a more sophisticated way. So when you talk about effective education involving, at least in many cases, breaking more complicated skills into smaller skills and teaching those smaller skills in a very systematic way where the student gets immediate feedback about how well they're doing, and they get immediate reinforcement when they do well, and they move sequentially through a program that takes them from simple skills to more complex skills, building on each skill along the way. Well, computers are exquisite for that. They can be programmed to do that in a very impressive way, in that a lot of material can be delivered in programs. There can be lots of opportunities to take and retake assessments, or to complete exercises and things of that sort until you've actually mastered it, without having to have things printed up in advance or someone monitoring it. It can all be done automatically. And of course, the kind of outcomes for performance, especially for young kids, can be a lot flashier and a lot more fun, maybe, than they often are in a classroom when a teacher delivers it. They could get exposed to a much wider range of things as a result of them engaging in appropriate academic behavior. The kinds of games that they want to play, there can be a whole range of them, the kinds of things they get access to. So I think technology, if we're talking like digital technology, computer technology, could be wonderful, but it isn't the answer. It's wonderful in the sense that it allows us to use what we already know about effective educational environments and effective educational arrangements, and to deliver them in much more efficient ways, and probably to disseminate them much more widely than we could otherwise.
Behavior analysis has really been evolving from the general education field, from the experimental analysis of behavior, and has since developed into the area of autism interventions particularly. Of course, it has always been used in general education. In fact, in the 70s, it would have been the way to help with education in schools, like programmed instruction, like peer tutoring. There were a lot of different methods that were used in schools, and we seem to have forgotten about those methods at the moment. And I think sometimes there has been an educational ideology that has overridden our actual practice, what works approach, where out of ideological reasons you're not supposed to do this, that and the other because it doesn't fit with the ideology. And I think we need to go back to the very practice of teaching, and teaching to be done with the effect of actually learning. That learning happens. We can then decide what the learning outcomes should be. We might change the learning outcomes. We might decide that at the moment learning how to learn would be a very good learning outcome. That's fine. I'm all for that. But what we need to know is, how do we teach students, pupils, to get there? It's good to have a target, but very often we end up just talking about the targets instead of also talking about the practice of actually getting there.
I'm in this camp of behavior analysts who regard ourselves as what we call radical behaviorists. And radical behaviorist is just a cool title, but it means more than that. And one of the things that radical behaviorists believe is that we can actually save the world through applied behavior analysis. That may be a real lofty goal, but it's a worthy goal. Behavior analysis helps take emotion out of things. It removes conjecture and speculation that sometimes is the predominant way we tend to think about human behavior. We define a behavior so that it can be objectively observed, we measure it, and then we do whatever it is we think can change the behavior, measuring it all the while to see if it actually changes. If it doesn't, we change what we do. Behavior analysis is great because it's pragmatic. If it's not working, we find something that will work. Behavior analysts, I find to be the most optimistic, dedicated, decent people who, again, regard individuals as important and don't consider people to be part of some homogeneous group. Each person is different. Each situation is different, which requires us to assess and treat each case on an individual basis.